this is the full audience. So, welcome to TOK Series 2022. This is PT number 1, and today we have various representatives. We are required to think about mathematics today, so representing the area of knowledge mathematics, Mr. Bravone, thanks for joining us. Representing TOK itself, and perhaps also the arts, Mr. Henrik. And our brave TOK seniors, Savelli and Jennifer. All right, so as you see behind me on the board, PT number 1 says a very simple question. Can there be knowledge that is independent of culture? And there are 2 key words that stand out immediately, and in traditional TOK manner, we should probably think about our definitions of those terms first, both independence and culture. And before we get there, I might just kind of remind us what we take knowledge to be. So in TOK, we never really want to define knowledge. We want to stay grounded, closer to its practical usage. But we do want to think about knowledge as a product of intellectual activity. Maybe it's true justified beliefs, something like this. So can we have true justified beliefs, some version of knowledge that is independent of culture? Perhaps as the token TOK teacher, Mr. Henrik, would you mind getting us started with a rough and ready definition of what you take culture to be?
Interesting. I wanted to take independent. Is that okay?
Go with independence.
Okay. I don't know if I want to start out by defining independent as much as questioning how we want to make that division, because depending on how we make that division, I think it's going to shape a lot of this discussion. So, and I guess we can have an agreement as a group about that. Is independent meaning completely independent, as in imagining a solitary creature that is not engaged in any sort of culture? Or are we saying independent as in we are beings engaged in a culture, we are doing cultural activity, but this type of knowledge is separate from that? Does that make sense, or do I need to rephrase that?
Could you rephrase it one more time?
Yeah, so basically what I'm saying is when we think about culture, there's and independence in this way, I think there's 2 ways of thinking of it. One, a being without culture. Right? So we can imagine a creature that is solitary, truly not a social creature, maybe one that's highly intelligent.
So like not associated with a culture.
Yeah, so I mean, we can think, I'm trying to think of a truly solitary animal of some intelligence. And we can even talk if that's possible. We can imagine one, right? We can imagine an alien that shows up, solitary, happened upon math on its own, all these sort of things, perhaps. And that's one example of independence. And the other example would be, I think what would probably be more common, we are all part of culture, they're animals with culture. The independence is the knowledge itself is separate from that part of their life, the cultural part of their life, right? So maybe we say mathematics could be happened upon by a creature that grew up in a culture, but it's somehow independent from that culture.
I think in this case the PT is asking us about the knowledge being independent from the culture. So for example, the mathematics being independent of the culture, or the arts being independent of the culture, not just a person like who is good at mathematics or like who is an artist, he doesn't have any culture. I think it's more of like arts or math being independent of the...
So you mean like the person or like someone who has the knowledge is in culture, but the knowledge itself is separate from the culture?
Yeah, I'm saying like that the knowledge is separate from the culture.
Yeah, I think the value of the first idea of this individual, this uncultured individual, not in a pejorative sense, not in a negative sense, but in a sense that they somehow evolved and became intelligent without a culture, is more of a thought experiment that we can return to. Personally, I guess to be able to even get to the second question, I think we have to grapple with this first question of whether that's possible or not. But I think we could put a pin in that and start off with this notion of we are all cultured individuals. Maybe there's some sorts of knowledge that are independent of it.
I think if you're thinking about this hypothetical individual who's independent of all culture,
Yeah.
who's solitary, there are definitely certain areas of knowledge that this person or entity would also find to be truths, and there may be other areas of knowledge of which this person would have no understanding simply because it's not part of a culture, and that there are certain truths that are dependent on being with other individuals.
But,
Well, I mean, if you think about social norms, morals, it's very difficult to see how someone who's completely independent of culture would come up with social norms that people who are in a group would discover or live by.
for a culture to be a culture, if we say there's a hypothetical individual that's completely on its own, that person or a creature would develop its own way of living, develop its own understanding of the world. But because it's understood by only one person, could we still take that as a culture? Or to rephrase this, how many individuals should practice or like understand something for us to understand that knowledge to be a culture?
So how many people do you actually have to be considered a
Yeah,
culture?
because my question is, if there's a hypothetical individual, could we say that what that individual know, could we like say that what that person is used to is also a culture? Or is it just individual knowledge,
Individual perception of the world.
but it's not a culture?
And I think this is getting exactly at why I think this hypothetical is really important for progressing, because that's another sort of question. If we say an individual can have a unique culture, we need to understand what it is that allows that. You know, it helps us define culture, right? I personally, my knee-jerk reaction is an individual cannot have a culture. The necessary component of culture is intersubjectivity, the work of group, yeah. But yet at the same time, I think some of us would like to say that individual might be able to acquire knowledge. So I think it gets us right to that central space of, so we have an individual without culture, if we define culture as a group activity, as a social construction, that is acquiring knowledge, or maybe not. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so perhaps we can back up again and clarify what the PT is not asking. So it seems like this PT is not asking, can we share knowledge independently of the culture, or can we communicate knowledge independently of culture? Can we have knowledge that's independent of culture? Seems to be the question on the table. And so perhaps Mr. Henrik's thought experiment with one individual, that's an interesting exception. Can there be a community of one? Can there be a language of one? After all, it seems like language is going to be the main component of what we should focus on. Language tends to be a major component of what culture is. But I'd like to think about another distinction too, because often we can think of knowledge and culture in terms of what's explicit versus what's implicit. After all, Mr. Ravone mentioned social norms. A lot of the norms and customs we have in culture aren't explicitly given or written down at any point in our lives. Then again, we're familiar with them, we know them. Whereas knowledge, there tends to be an explicit nature to knowledge. If we really want to give something the stamp of being knowledge, it's explicit, whether it's in a textbook or other written form, that doesn't matter as much. Would any of you like to elaborate on this difference between laws and rules and explicit norms versus things more akin to habits or tendencies, and how that distinction might be relevant in solving this question?
Habits and tendencies. Well, I think of areas of knowledge that any culture would that all cultures would agree upon. Yes, you think of logic as something that everyone would agree upon. It's hard to imagine giving a logic puzzle. I know like people in the TOK department love to play with logic puzzles. If you gave a logic puzzle to people of different cultures, could they come up with different correct answers? Is that could we even conceive of that as being possible? And
the TOK background here. There's a thinker named Graham Priest who does a lot of work on what's called paralogic, basically examining cultural backgrounds that don't take paradoxes or contradictions as inherently wrong, right? So the basis of logic as practiced by most Western countries deriving from Aristotle and early Greek thinking is that that's one of the main tenets, right? If you have a contradiction, you gotta start out, you gotta either reformulate your premises or reformulate your argument. Priest seems to be arguing that there's actually is a lot of benefit to logic systems that allow for paradoxical answers, because maybe in this form of seeking knowledge, it's not about there being one truth. Sometimes contradictory truths can coexist, which I guess one could imagine then a logic puzzle where you get two contradictory answers and people go, oh, perfect, we've done our job.
I think in many areas of knowledge, like there are different ways that you can look at the problem, or like in arts, it would be at the artistic work. There are many ways depending on the culture that the person who is looking or who is solving a problem, for example in math, it probably could depend on like the way that person was educated and like on his cultural background. And I think like further on when we'll be developing our answer to this PT, I have some examples to share about specific examples to share about the math and the arts, for example.
Yeah. So perhaps now that Savelli mentions mathematics, this PT does tell us, interestingly, that we have to think about math. It pins down one area, and perhaps we'll get to the arts later. But the reason why this PT suggests mathematics is perhaps mathematics is the one AOK that seems to fit the bill here, that it can be detached or independent from culture. And perhaps a test we can think about to show that would be some kind of invariance under translation. After all, we know mathematics can be published in French or Japanese or German or English, but the community of expert mathematicians will still ultimately agree that regardless of the language it's expressed in, regardless of the culture it comes from, it's still pointing to the same theorem and truth. So as a possible counterexample, just to get us thinking about this, there is famously in recent history a proof by a Japanese mathematician for something called the ABC conjecture, an open, unsolved problem of mathematics. And the tricky thing was this Japanese mathematician had to invent whole new branches of math in order to solve the problem. And after decades of giving his proofs and going to talks and presentations, eventually the local Japanese community assimilated to his ideas, learned all the new mathematics, and put the stamp of approval on his theorem, saying that he's achieved success. That's not to say that the rest of the world has so far accepted it. So in the case of this Japanese mathematician, are we witnessing once again the cultural embeddedness of even a pure field like mathematics? Or do you think this will eventually end up in the same category as all other theorems, that regardless of the culture it comes from, regardless of the language it's expressed in, this will be ultimately a piece of knowledge that's detached from culture?
I think culture is very important in terms of mathematics, when dictating what mathematicians are actually going to look for and what they're going to study and what answers they're going to try to find. If you go back thousands of years, mathematicians were building pyramids or building other structures, and the math that they used was to the end of achieving those goals. And in that sense, the math was associated with a culture, is somehow, it's dictated by culture what you are going to study. But that doesn't mean that the mathematics itself is a product of the culture. The mathematics may still be out there for all cultures to discover. It's just that your culture kind of pushes you in one direction or pushes you in another direction. There are many proofs of mathematics that have been discovered, in different societies at different times. I mean, you think of something like Pascal's triangle. Well, Pascal discovered it at one point in time in his society, but then there's other societies that also discovered it at an earlier point in time. They discovered the same thing. It's just that, okay, in one society they might have been looking at this problem or this area of mathematics at this point in time, and then Pascal was looking at it in his society. He was looking at it because of what was going on at that time. Just like you think of the development of calculus. Well, why was calculus discovered? Because they were trying to figure out laws of planetary motion and all of that. And both Newton and Leibniz basically did it at the same time. But they were working on it because of what was going on in their culture at that time. It's like other cultures would have gotten there. It's like once they started working on problems that involved calculus, right? And I guess other societies in the past have basically looked at similar problems. They may not have developed it as fully as was developed in the 17th century, but they were trying to solve similar problems. And I think when you look at something like the ABC conjecture here, well, not all mathematics has been discovered. In one of the videos that Dr. K sent out, I guess I was looking at the other day, it was at Wolfram. He was talking about, well, there's lots of mathematics out there. The mathematics that we have we have it because it helps us solve problems in the real world. And these are our real world problems, so we develop the mathematics to solve those problems. Well, now here comes along something else, and okay, well, he develops this mathematics to solve some other problem, right? And so I guess in that sense, okay, it's cultural, but it's not necessarily independent of culture. The truth is there.
I think metaphorically this might help, coming from the English teacher background, for me to kind of make sense of this. It sounds to me almost like you're saying that there is this hard nugget called mathematics here, and there's all these people all over the world, and we're all working our way towards that nugget of mathematics based on what our culture is valuing at that moment. So if you're valuing constructing bridges, right, you're going to be doing and investigating towards that nugget in a different way than other people, but we're all working towards.
Right.
And I think that especially the word discover is central to this, right? The notion that it is out there to be discovered.
And that's debated still.
Well,
to this
exactly.
day.
So I think that's the question, right? Is it discovered or created? Right, like is mathematical knowledge being created in this pursuit? And so instead of describing it as we're working toward this core center, in the same way that we, let's say, create a new word, we're creating new systems. They're not out there to be found. They're being generated by novel humans trying to deal with the problems of their day. So the question of, was calculus out there to be discovered, or is it that each human community in dealing with the problem came up with the same sort of solutions? And it sounds, like I said, to me like yours is that there is this thing and we're working towards it. I'm wondering whether the two of you agree with that or with the notion of creative mathematics, like it being a creation of communities.
I personally agree on the nugget metaphor, because how I understand math is there is math, as you said, there is right there, but we just don't know that it exists. If the world is working, I think the world itself has its own rules, but we, like mathematicians, are trying to find a written law to justify what's going on, and that's like maybe, as you said, it's like creating a system to translate what's being done mathematically. But I think it's more of like what's the word? Discovery.
Yeah.
Discovering what's out there, but not like creating a whole new math system.
Yes, I definitely agree with this idea because I think that math is a highly fundamental science, and I think like it all started with ancient people who were just like doing their calculations with the stones or like with the sticks, and then the math was developing, and it came to the point that there are multiple solutions, multiple ways to solve difficult problems in the modern world, and looking at math from this way, I would say that it doesn't depend on the cultural background, but as a Russian student, I came to a different society, to an American high school. And I noticed that people here, they don't use the discriminant rule to solve the quadratic equations, which me and other Russian people who might be watching this, they would understand, they would relate to me. So our way of solving the quadratic equations is through discriminant, and that's the only way we know how to solve them, while American kids or like kids coming from Asian countries, they use how is it?
Factoring.
Yeah, factoring rule. So I think Matt, he's sitting here, he would relate to me, knowing that we always use discriminant, which is like it depends on our cultural background, I think.
But that's just usage. I mean, it's still true that both work.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's like different approaches on how to solve one thing. Like
Yes, I think it depends on the like cultural background, the approaches.
educational culture.
And there are lots of problems in mathematics that can be solved various ways, and it may be somewhat culturally dependent how you go about solving it. But that still doesn't mean that the truth of the various ways wouldn't exist in all cultures. It's just that, okay, certain cultures have tended towards this method and others have tended towards this method. And it's very difficult to conceive of 1 + 1 being something other than 2. And possibly maybe that's just because as human beings we can't conceive it. Maybe there is some system where 1 + 1 is not 2, but we just are completely unable to comprehend it as human beings.
I think that's closer to my naive assumptions about mathematics, is that in the same way that cross-culturally people, as biological beings, cross-culturally we have certain sensory modalities, sight, sound, smell, all these sort of things, right? That can be inhibited based on being born with certain changes or things throughout your life, but generally we have these similar modalities cross-culturally. And so in language, even though we have these different language forms, we can still translate ideas, right? Sight is translatable. It's an idea that's translatable between. But what I wonder about is whether we would be doing math in a way that's even sensible to us if we were a different biological creature, if we weren't born with the brain that we have, if this is maybe not culturally determined in the same way as it is biologically structured.
It would be interesting when we finally do meet Klingons
Yeah.
and see what their mathematics is like. Then maybe we'll get an answer. I mean, we can't talk to our dogs about it, unfortunately. They just aren't capable of doing the same math. But, I mean, if you could actually find some other intelligent being that you could discuss mathematics with.
Well, and I think what you brought up with dogs is really interesting because, if I remember correctly, there is evidence that animals show mathematical reasoning, even if it's not self-conscious mathematical reasoning, right? Like they make decisions based on mathematical guesses about the future. But is that math proper, or is that some sort of reasoning skill, you know?
Yeah. Another thing, while we're still discussing mathematics, just to throw a little bit more counterexample into the mix. Famously, the foundations of mathematics, we've been talking about doing mathematics in all these different ways, but the foundations of mathematics, how we kind of really rigorously found the knowledge of math, historically and famously have been permanently entangled with theologians, certain religious convictions. And besides language itself, it seems like religion is going to be another key component of what culture amounts to. So even those of us that take math to be discovered instead of invented, how do we come to terms with this? How do we recognize that these questions of the foundations of math seem to be entangled with questions of religion?
I can start this off. I was raised and I'm still in a Christian community, and what my middle school teachers would tell me is the world is already set by God. I'm still like, sometimes I still question what I learned, but they're like, it's already there, so God is the one who creates, humans are the ones who discover what he had already created. That's why I kind of said math is already there, we're just finding and navigating ways to interpret what's out there, but not like actually creating a new whole system. Yes.
That actually doesn't sound much different from Einstein's space-time. Like, everything is already there, right? It's like space and time, that block, it already exists. It's just, okay, you're at a different point in space, you're at a different point in time.
To your point, I feel like there's been a long history in religion of searching for ways in which to ground your religious thinking in objectivity, right? And there's nothing that seems, I mean, even from this discussion, more objective than math. Of all the areas of knowledge, it's one where we feel most comfortable going, well, yeah, it's there, it's solid, it's unquestionable. And if you could take that knowledge and intertwine it with religion in such a way that you say, and the reason is because it's this fundamental nature of reality that God set forth, suddenly that imbues your religious belief with so much more rigor, seeming rigor at least. So it makes perfect sense to me, and it turns back to this idea that cultural motivation, I think we're all in agreement, is certainly built into mathematics. Why you're doing mathematics and for what reason, and then how you conceptualize mathematics, I think, also is culturally driven. If you want to be, if you're in a secular society or in a secular group and you want to have your knowledge be secular, you're going to disentangle. You want to put a clear dividing line. Math's over here, and then these questions about religion are over here, right? But if you're in a non-secular society, maybe you want to intertwine those. Give the authority of math to the authority that religion looks for.
So you're trying to say that depending on how much society is cultural, I'm trying to say how much society is religious, like a culture is religious. It depends on the way that they perceive different areas of knowledge, like math.
Not quite. It's more, you can understand why religion would want to take math as it being seemingly to most people the most objective thing and say, look, we have this thing that we all see that seems to be independent of humans.
Yeah.
Where could it be coming from other than God? And once you add those two together, it adds so much authority to the presence and adds a necessity in a way, right? Because otherwise, we are left, where does math come from? I think in a secular society, you end up trying to come up with new definitions for it. But those two seem to go together easily, and I can understand why religious figures and thinkers can turn to that and go, whoa, here's some grounding.
There can also be a very just practical understanding of this. If you're part of the priesthood, the religious community, you don't work. Okay? You're not out in the fields. You're not out there building houses. What are you doing? Well, you got time to study. right? So it's like, okay, so why were these religious people throughout the centuries delving into mathematics or science or other areas? Because they have the time to do it.
You think about churches as well, right? So if you want to cause awe in your church going public, and you're able to build these massive buildings that far outstrip the rudimentary housing of the places nearby, you're going to need to know math to do it, right?
Yeah.
So George Cantor in his spare time just creates set theory.
Yeah,
Nothing better to
it's
do.
like,
Yeah.
if you're okay, there are people who are like, I guess Tesla, who was digging ditches in New York City for like gas lines or something, and as he was doing that, he was thinking up all of his, work on electricity. But most people, when they're out there digging ditches and doing manual labor, they're not spending their time on rigorous mathematics. But if you're in the priesthood, you've got a lot of time.
Right.
So yes, you can do it.
Right. So perhaps now we'll switch gears on the spectrum from discovery to invention and move from discovery in mathematics to perhaps the AOK that epitomizes invention, which might be the arts. So on the flip side, we might all be inclined to argue that artistic knowledge cannot be detached from the cultural context. And so just superficially, how do we feel about the arts in terms of this PT?
It is most likely that, it's definitely everybody agrees that art pieces are created by people, and therefore those people were affected by some of their cultural backgrounds, by the education that they got. Probably their parents, they were telling them something, or people who were living at the same time, there were some trends or something like that. I don't know how people called it like back then. And therefore I think in arts, culture highly affects what people create, the songs they make, or the paintings they draw. I think that's it, yeah.
I think fundamentally the materials that are used to create art and artwork, or the knowledge of what to use to create an art piece, would definitely differ in cultures. If we go back centuries, I'm from Korea, and when I look at the artwork from my history, it's all like octopus. What's that called? Ink.
Yeah.
That's what they would mainly use. It's usually all black and white. There are some pigments that are red or blue for the kings. But then if I look at other Western countries, I know that I've heard that they used purple. But purple was not existent in my country at that period of time. So we have different knowledge on what pigments we could use, what colors we could actually put on, even making papers. So I think before expressing what the artists have in their minds, what they have in their hands initially was really dependent on their cultures.
To maybe give an example of something or some things that might, aspire to the realm of mathematics, as we were chatting about. It seems ubiquitous across cultures that you have certain forms of art, dance, singing, some sort of poetry, very broadly defined. I think if you look cross-culturally too, you will generally find geometric shapes of some sort, if we were to think again of maybe tying that into mathematics. So how that is done seems to be totally culturally dependent. But looking globally, for some reason humans, we like to dance, right? And so is that, independent of culture in a way? To bury the lead a little bit for me, I think it does go back to biology. But with that being said, it does seem to be independent of each individual culture, these sort of broader modalities or ways of doing art and being artistic.
It does seem like it is very biologically determined that okay, you painted with octopus ink, but everywhere else people painted, right? In some way, they used what they had. I mean, they drew using blood or whatever it was that they would have. They could make paints out of the materials at hand, but they painted. Just as make jewelry, they sang songs, as he said. I mean, all of these things happen wherever you go in the world. It is different, but it does seem to be heavily biologically determined that we are going to do this just by the fact that we are human beings.
Yeah, and maybe even just this idea that, I mean, no one tells someone you need to paint necessarily, right? No one says, it's time for you to do your visual depiction, right? It seems to be this thing that just grows out of some of us, and some of us less so, but if we think of it as being like this natural outgrowth of some wiring or some aspect of our communal being, it does seem to happen cross-culturally.
Possibly then as a final thought, so we've thought about mathematics and the end of discovery and the arts and more on the end of invention. If we take an AOK in the middle, that's arguably, it's a big question whether this field is about discovery or invention, which is ethics. So if we think about ethics for a second in this PT, can there be ethical knowledge that is independent of culture? We might be getting some different results. So we first might want to think, is ethical knowledge discovered or invented? To go back to that question. What do panelists think here?
I don't know that you do get necessarily enormously different results. How many societies say, sure, go steal from your neighbor? Is that acceptable? And has it been acceptable anywhere? I mean, of course, between communities, maybe they look at it differently.
So
like within your community, do you say, yeah, you just go beat him over the head with a club and take his stuff?
Well, I think it is this idea of not internal to communities, but between communities. And I mean, the TOK philosophy sort of study here, the spectrum of ethics actually gets surprisingly broad. For example, one thing that comes to mind always is the ethical beliefs that we have in many countries and groups against cannibalism. That not being a universal belief. It's seemingly to us as being like of course, right? That must be, how bad can that be? That clearly, to this day in communities is not something that they have ethical issues with. Things like incest, right? There are communities today that do not consider it an ethical violation, maybe a bad taste thing. But so there is a fair amount of variation there. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that for now. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to support your point that I just wanted to add like an example about poaching. So in most of the countries it's immoral, and governments are banning killing of elephants in order to get their, how you call this?
Tusks.
Tusks,
Ivory.
yeah. But there are several cultures, several countries where people believe that the tusks of those animals, they bring you luck or they bring you health, and therefore there is nothing ethically wrong, ethically incorrect with killing those animals for the tusks, even though it destroys the biodiversity.
And to even get down to the level of stealing, I mean, there are many cultural groups, less I think in the world than there used to be, that would consider private property itself an ethically wrong notion, right? So the ownership of anything outside of one's body maybe being ethically dubious, right? Why do I have more ownership of this table than you do, right? It's not stealing, I'm borrowing it, I'll bring it back tomorrow.
But I mean, would those societies accept, okay, I'm taking your food from your children? I don't.
So that's a great, so in situations of need, right? So maybe notions if we were going to have a more objective ethical system, it would be when one is encountering need, things that violate those fundamental necessities of life. I know that some, I guess you call them Inuit communities, do practice radical sharing of food. That it's not your food. That if the community is starving, you're starving with it. So even though you went and hunted, killed the seal, for example, that's not yours. You are going to share it equally, and if we're all starving, we're going to make a communal decision about maybe not feeding the elderly people. And I do know that they've been known to not feed babies, to say it's just not going to happen this year. The situation is so dire that...
But they're making life and death decisions at that point.
Yeah.
It's like, it does seem that there are certain principles that if you don't follow, society falls apart. And I would think that most societies throughout history have adhered to such basic principles. Like, you just can't murder someone because you want to. I don't know that there is a society where this is accepted unless, you know, like you're the emperor and you want to kill this person and you just go ahead and do it. But at a certain level, most societies do have some similar moral codes and norms that they follow that prevent the society from disintegrating into chaos.
I guess I would say that the thing that stops society from disintegrating into chaos is ethics, period. I don't know if the ethical systems need to be similar in order to do that. So I think, personally, ethical systems arise based on the circumstances the society is dealing with. So those ethical systems, like we discussed with the Inuit, may be dramatically diverse, or disparate, I should say, from our own, as a means of coping with the radical scarcity of their environment, in a way that in a place of relative abundance, you may have dramatically...
So I mean, it's like you're saying, like, it's almost like art here. It's like, oh, it's because of what they have that this is what they use, or this is what they develop.
Yeah, I think
In a way.
art with taste, right? So
Yeah.
you use the octopus ink because it's what you have, but then maybe as time goes on, you have certain refinements and rules that aren't based on necessity, but based on taste. You say, okay, well, we're going to use octopus ink because it's what we have. However, when you're doing this type of art, no octopus ink is allowed. We're going to use this other thing because we like that. That's just what we decided socially.
It's like morals somehow develop the same way. It's like, okay, you have to decide, are we going to feed, you know, this 90-year-old man who's here for the winter? And so you have to make a decision. Whereas, yes, in other societies, people say, wow, this is terrible, but they don't have to make that decision.
Yeah, that'd be my argument, probably. Yeah.
So back to the final question, is ethical knowledge discovered or invented?
I'll stop talking here, but another interesting note, though, is when you do look at certain teachings, like Thich Nhat Hanh, who wrote his book on Buddha and Jesus, and he took them word for word, the phrases that are attributed to Buddha and the phrases that are attributed to Jesus, and it's like, well, look at how similar they are. And it's like, okay, they're like centuries apart, thousands of miles away. It's like, but their moral teachings are so similar to each other. It's like, okay, well, how did they both come to these same phrases?
But I think like we should look at ethics from way before the religions appeared, and I think ethics they were nor discovered or invented. People were just uncomfortable living with each other, like in the tribes, without any ethics, like without any rules that they like just basic rules not to steal each other's shelter, or not to steal each other's like cave or wherever they were living, or not to steal each other's food, for example. And so people did not understand that these were ethics, and then they were just going along with the development of the people, with the progress of them. People started like speaking, people started then creating different technologies, and ethics were going along. I think ethics were like at the beginning, like when people started living with each other, communicating.
Invented.
Invented. Final answer, Jennifer? Discovered or invented?
I would say maybe at the beginning stage it was invented, but then it was discovered as the culture developed.
So I think we should end with that compromise position. Perfect finale. All right, so thanks to all the panelists for coming today. And lastly, per tradition, we open up to the massive audience for any questions that might be on the mind.
I mean, the main question I had about coming back to almost the start of the conversation is that, like, at that point, what is culture aside from conventions? Because we have a culture, because we have a system to compare it to. So, why culture gives us a bias? And what is, in this case, a bias? So, I mean, for me, I was curious about where was your distinguishment between math and culture. Like, math at the end of the day is just a set of conventions we use to arrive to certain conclusions. We have a one, we have another one, we add it, and then we have a two, you know? And a culture in this case is based off your own personal set of conventions you've been grown up with, social culturally based, like you arrive to certain conclusions. But what is the difference? Like, is it about perception? Is it about, I don't know, I wondered what were your thoughts on that?
I feel like people, if I interpret your question correctly, I think that people want to make a distinction because there seems to be not a rigidity, because that's, again, that sounds too negative, but there seems to be a rigor and an ability to say, well, this is the answer about mathematics that one really never gets in culture. I mean, to some degree, I guess if you have a really homogeneous culture where everyone agrees with the same thing, you can get an answer that you're like, yep, if you ask anyone here, they're going to say this is the answer of a cultural belief. But that doesn't seem to hold the same weight that mathematics does. With that being said, I do think your question is a valid one. Mathematics being something that we develop in order to cope with and understand, is that, I mean, basically, if you think about it like this, is mathematics this thing that's being created a net that we are just using to map a world, or is it, again, like a drill as we're getting closer to the nugget of what math really is in its true form?
Mm-hmm.
I did have one question, and it ties in with like this idea of whether math is created or discovered, which is a very interesting question that could be its own separate debate, right? Because at one point, you guys were talking about like building bridges and pyramids, right? And then at one point we were talking about like set theory, which is a much more theoretical thing. So my question is, like, when talking about whether math is created or discovered, how much of it depends on whether you're talking about theoretical versus like applied or practical mathematics? Like, or are they tied together? Like, because that was a very, that just sort of came to me.
I would say when we were talking about theoretical knowledge, the person or like the society might at first conceive it as created because it's theoretical, it never have been practiced, we never know if it's actually going to happen in real life. It might seem created, but if we actually do it in real life and now that's no longer theoretical, then it might be seen as now discovered of what happens in real life, if that answers.
Mm-hmm. There are properties of mathematics like complex numbers, which people have, I guess, discovered before they knew of any practical use for it, and then afterwards they found, oh, this actually it does have a practical use. We can actually apply this, and it does help us to describe the real world. So it's possible you move from this theoretical realm into a practical realm. But then, it may be that there is some realm of mathematics that is purely theoretical, that doesn't actually describe the world, and maybe we'll never get there because we just can't conceive of it.
And I think from my head, this may be off, but it just came to me. The Greeks finding out the way that mathematics and music tie together, I think it's like a great example of one where it's like this mixture of theory and practice, where they're doing mathematical thinking and they're realizing how well it maps on to their, theories about music, and then that's further driving this mathematical thinking. I feel like that shows how interconnected they are, that as soon as you are doing one, you're pushing the other.
And it can works both
Yeah,
ways.
exactly.
It's like you could go from the practical to the theoretical, or from the theoretical to the practical.
Yeah.
Right. And that's probably why ethics was so, like Jennifer's compromise position of being maybe invention at first and then discovery later on, because if you think of a theory of ethics, it's almost intrinsically, it's theoretical and then simultaneously about the most practical way of living one's life. And so I think it's a temptation to put those in one-to-one correspondence, theory and practice, and then discovery, invention. Another example I would want to add in the case of mathematics would be prime numbers and their use in cryptography. I personally would count that as a discovered, in the most radical Platonic sense, a discovered application. Like that's an out there discovery in Plato's forms, but it's precisely an application. And an application that keeps our stuff safe and private, yeah. Yeah. Any last questions from the audience?
Yeah, I had this question initially when you even introduced the word knowledge.
Yeah.
Because you said that the product, it's basically a product of intellectual activity, right? And so I, as a TOK student, was trying to find contradictions already in not even contradictions, just examples that will be outside of this definition. And when you mentioned the metaphor of a nugget that we all trying to, in terms of math, there's something undiscovered that we all try to, acquire and understand. This idea came to my mind that the story of this Italian philosopher Giordano Bruno, right, who was burnt on the stake because of his beliefs and space systems and infinite universe. And at that time, if you come back with a time travel machine from here now, when we all kind of agree, it's like a universal belief that we do exist in a universe, and all what this guy said is actually true, and we can consider it as a knowledge. However, if you still understand that at that time by society it was not considered as a knowledge, so would you still consider it would you then consider it as independent knowledge, that it's outside of our culture? However, it's still true, and we can discover potentially, and it was discovered by some members of our culture, but it's outside of it. So that was what concerning.
I think that's a really good point, and I think if we had another hour and a half, 2 hours, we could get at this, but I mean, basically what you're saying is that discoveries that we now count as knowledge,
Right.
in the time that it happened, were considered either blasphemous or just wrong. I think that gets to this notion of justified true belief, which I'm sure in TOK we talk about all the time. You can imagine a stark raving person walking around in ancient Greece just saying, atoms exist, which there was, right? And you could say, well, it wasn't justified at the time, so we can have called it knowledge then, even though it was true. Or you could say it was justified, depends on your opinion. But I think that's the value of that, is saying, well, knowledge still needs that justificatory scheme, that culturally determined scheme. And if it's not there, even though it's true, it's not knowledge. We can't say that person truly has it.
And then, of course, on the flip side, there may be some bits of knowledge that we all take to be true, which are actually not.
Exactly.
It's like it can work both ways.
Yeah, so we all are justified in our beliefs, but they're not true, perhaps.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Cool. So, all right. So we haven't decided whether knowledge can be independent of culture, but I think we know that culture can be independent of knowledge. Cool. All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you, YouTube. All right.
Thank you, Artie.